If I could have everybody's attention, we'd like to begin. My name is Alan Luxembourg. I'm president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And since I haven't seen many of you all year, let me wish you all a Happy New Year. Judging by the last few days, it ought to be a very wild ride this year. I'd like to begin first by thanking the National Liberty Museum for hosting this series once again, and thanking BNY Mellon Wealth Management, represented by our trustee, Michael Barron, for sponsoring this series as well. Before we begin tonight's program, I did want to mention that tonight we kick off our Geopolitics with Granary in the new format, new venue, new time frame. Then on February 23rd, we launch our Princeton series with Robert Litvak talking about the threat from North Korea. On March 8th, we launch our mainline briefings, which are no longer breakfast briefings, but evening briefings at the Merion Cricket Club. And that will feature our fellow Clint Watts on Russian information operations. It's a great talk. He just gave it for us in Manhattan, and can't say it's a happy talk, but it's a good talk. April 8th, we launch our New York Historical Society lecture series with Jeremy Black on World War I. So, tonight, we welcome back our old friend, Robert Kaplan. We've been working with Bob since 1993. I think we've hosted 91. Oh, excuse me. We've hosted a book talk for each one of his last 15 of 17 books, I think. And the only problem, as I may have said before to you, the only problem I have with Bob is that 20 years ago, I looked a lot younger, but he looks like he looks 20 years ago, and that gives me grief. Now I'll turn the proceedings over to my colleague, Ron Granary, the host of Geopolitics with Granary. So please welcome Ron and Bob.
Thanks very much, Alan. Thanks very much, everybody, for joining us here tonight. As I like to say at the beginning of all these programs, it's Tuesday in Philadelphia, and the world is as complicated as ever, so let's talk about it. Welcome to the January 2017 edition of Geopolitics with Granary, FPRI's monthly discussion of international affairs. This is the first program in our 5th season here at Geopolitics with Granary. We were talking about at the beginning. It's who knew it would last this long, and we'll see how much longer it lasts after tonight. But it's a pleasure to have you all with us. I am indeed Ron Granary, the director of FPRI's Center for the Study of America and the West. I'll be the host and moderator of our discussion. All of us at FPRI, thank you for joining us live and archived on the internet, and for the first time live on our YouTube web stream, and live this evening here at the National Liberty Museum in Philadelphia on January 24th, 2017. It's a real pleasure to have you all with us, and as Alan said, this is the beginning of a new experiment with Geopolitics with Granary, an evening event rather than a daytime event. We're already very gratified by the size of the audience, which I, of course, attribute to the importance of our guest, which is always nice. We're going to have the format will stay similar to the other times we've done this, right? I have an introduction. We're going to talk about Bob's book. We're going to talk about his work. I have questions for him. He has responses, and then we hope that you will have questions as well. There will be time for questions from the audience and time for the questions from the online audience as well. We're looking forward to seeing how that all goes. Tonight's discussion centers around a term that is near and dear to the hearts of all of us at FPRI, and especially to the host of this program. That term, of course, being the magic word geopolitics. Although the term can have different specific meanings, depending on the speaker and the audience, geopolitics highlights the interplay between the natural world and human action, between the apparently eternal and unavoidable realities of geography and the efforts of human beings over time, not only to adapt to the natural world, but to force the natural world to adapt to human ingenuity. Tonight's guest, Robert Kaplan, is one of the most prominent geopolitical analysts working today. The author of bestsellers with such dramatic and some could say dire names as Balkan Ghosts, Asia's Cauldron, The Coming Anarchy, and of course, The Revenge of Geography. His most recent book, which is released officially today, is Earning the Rockies, How Geography Shapes America's Role in the World, a meditation on the relationship of geography to the American destiny, manifest or otherwise. Retracing a route across the United States traveled by his father, Kaplan takes us from the Berkshires to San Diego. Inspired by a variety of writers, from Bernard DeVoto to Wallace Stegner, he contrasts the vertical landscape of the East with the horizontal landscape of the great American desert, all the while observing, listening to the people inhabiting the towns along the way, and pondering the significance of our geographical inheritance for the past, present, and future of the United States. Hovering over his work is the spirit of historian Frederick Jackson Turner, whose 1893 essay on the significance of the frontier in American history first advanced the notion that the frontier experience shaped American society in ways that made it profoundly different from the European societies that initially nurtured it. Idealized concepts have rarely taken firm root in America, Kaplan tells us at one point, and so intellectuals have had to look to Europe for inspiration. People here are too busy making money. An extension, of course, he writes, of the frontier ethos with its emphasis on practical initiative. Particularly important for Kaplan, if I can say that in the author's presence, is the idea that the people in the vast American heartland are more grounded, contrasting their connection to their terrain with the, quote, fatal weakness of global culture. The challenges of Western geography encouraged a degree of risk-taking, what Kaplan calls a fundamental aspect of the American personality. For Kaplan, as for Turner, conquering the frontier didn't just make the United States. It made Americans, even if it is hard to say where the outside world's influence ends and human choices begin. Geography does not determine individual character, he concedes at one point, but it does matter. The temperate climate of North America provides vast bounty. The river system makes possible the transport of goods and connections across regions that encouraged nation building. And thus, he concludes, geography remains an overwhelming advantage and source of American power. Indeed, because of that geography, America is, quote, fated to lead. And there's the rub, for Kaplan is much too internationally minded to allow his continental reflections to lapse into splendid isolation. History and geography link the United States to the larger world. They do not separate them. History and geography are a source of responsibility for the present and responsibility to future generations. Kaplan is a patriot, but not blind to the crimes that accompanied the development of the United States, from slavery to the genocidal campaigns against Native Americans. Even as he encourages readers to confront those dark stains, however, he also tries to draw positive conclusions, declaring at one point as he reflected on a visit to South Dakota's Black Hills, quote, "The only answer to the crime committed here is for the United States to use the resulting power that has come with the conquest of a continent in order to continue to do good in the world." Or, as he concludes elsewhere, "No place in the world can be ignored. That is the legacy of America's geography." And yet we are left wrestling with the uncomfortable paradox. How can the same continental vastness that has insulated America and Americans from world affairs also encourage, let alone require, continued engagement with the wider world? How can we celebrate the hardy, insular children of the soil of the great interior while also expecting those Americans to send their children to defend the great intermarium in Central Europe, or to set sail from San Diego in one of the aircraft carriers Kaplan describes so well, in order to preserve freedom of navigation in the South China Sea? Kaplan concludes that we must, quote, "sustain ourselves internationally even as we remember that the lessons of successful empires have been restraint, caution, and strategic patience, and that the future depends upon remembering all and not just some of the lessons of the frontier." So what are those lessons? How has geography shaped the American historical experience? How does it continue to shape American politics and culture? How have technological developments changed or failed to change the way Americans relate to their geographical inheritance? And what implications do all these questions have for America's future global role? These questions and yours will guide us in conversation with our guest, Robert D. Kaplan. Robert Kaplan is the best-selling author of 17 books of foreign affairs and travel, including Earning the Rockies, In Europe's Shadow, Asia's Cauldron, Monsoon, The Balkan Ghosts, The Coming Anarchy. He is a senior fellow at the Center for New American Security and a senior advisor at Eurasia Group. For 3 decades, his work has appeared in The Atlantic. He was chief geopolitical analyst at Stratfor, a visiting professor at the United States Naval Academy, and a member of the Pentagon's Defense Policy Board, appointed by Secretary of Defense Robert Gates. Foreign Policy magazine twice named him one of the world's top 100 global thinkers. Mr. Kaplan has reported from over 100 countries, and his essays have appeared on the editorial pages of the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, as well as in major foreign affairs journals. He has briefed presidents, secretaries of state, and defense secretaries, including delivering the Secretary of State's open forum lecture at the U.S. State Department. For all of these reasons, we are delighted to have this world-renowned scholar and long-term friend of FPRI with us tonight. Welcome, Robert Kaplan.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
I wanted to start by asking you a basic question, and that is, this book is a slight departure for you. It's a little more personal, and it's focused on the United States at home.
Right.
What led you to write this particular book?
Well, first of all, thank you for hosting me again, and thank you for the 27-year-long relationship with FPRI that I've had. In terms of this book had an odd origin. Mm-hmm. I originally wanted to write something long about Bernard DeVoto. Bernard DeVoto in the 1940s and 50s might have been the most famous American intellectual for many years, and yet now his name is completely forgotten. And it's completely forgotten because although a liberal throughout his life, who was always right on every issue, mm-hmm. He was right on the menace of Nazism and Stalin long before the other intellectuals. He was right on conservation, mm-hmm. on many things, because the Academy moved so far to the left after the Vietnam War that it wasn't that they rebuked him, they just cast him aside. Mm-hmm. So I decided I wanted to write about DeVoto. Mm-hmm. Then I realized I need to write something about my father. Not something long, just something. So I said, a chapter on my father, on DeVoto, that's not a book. I said, well, where does that lead? When you put the two together, it leads to a journey across the United States. Sure. And then I said, well, where does that lead? Well, it leads to a reflection on world affairs and America's role in the world. Mm-hmm. So what I cobbled together was a book that, in a sense, is a series of essays. Mm-hmm. Though I wouldn't call it that. And I was very nervous about it because mm-hmm. I wasn't sure if it worked as a book. So I sent, after I finished it, I sent the draft to one of my literary agents, Henry Thayer, a very young, brilliant young man. And I waited anxiously for his response, and he responded, he says, this is perfect, and it's better because it's short. We don't have to do much with it.
The marketing department
loved that. Because it's there, mm-hmm. It works. So then I knew I had something, but mm-hmm. usually you have an idea for a book and you write the book. This started from particulars that grew into something larger.
So was it easier or more difficult to do?
Parts of it were easy, mm-hmm. parts of it, but required lots of rewriting. Mm-hmm. Parts of it were more difficult. I would say that each part was a different writing experience, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. I'm so glad that you specifically mentioned DeVoto to start, because something struck me when I was reading the book. For those of you who haven't read a lot of Robert DeVoto, his 1846, The Year of Decision, is a famous description of 19th century American politics and about the discovery of the West. And as it happens, the book Historians' Fallacy, which is this compendium of criticisms of historians. David Hackett Fisher specifically singles out DeVoto as an example of the aesthetic fallacy. without concluding that he is torn between two inconsistent objects: to tell what actually happened and to tell a beautiful story. In pursuit of the two purposes, he operates at cross purposes and diminishes the degree to which either is fulfilled. Now, I'm sure you want to defend Devoto, and I want you to do that, but I want to ask this as a question for somebody who writes books and also magazine articles that have to grab the audience. How do you see the tension between to tell a beautiful story or an interesting story versus trying to be scrupulously accurate?
I don't see a contradiction. I think this comment by David Hackett Fisher is a perfect example of academic deconstructionism, in the sense that Devoto did most of his research in the Harvard Library. He went out on foot and horseback and would not write about a place until he saw it with his own eyes. He grew up in Utah at the turn of the 20th century, so had an innate organic knowledge of the American West that later historians did not have. And he was able to connect with both academics at the time, intellectuals, and the average person. And he did tell a great story. He writes so much better than most people today could ever hope to write.
Sure.
And finally, he was someone who had great fundamental arresting truths. He was an inductive thinker, much like Sam Huntington, who also angered many of his academic colleagues.
Indeed.
I mean, you know, Devoto's comment that America was an empire, a state, and a civilization all at once was one of his things. Another was that America's geographic bounty made it natural for it to be engaged in the world, which went against the grain of so many isolationist thinkers who thought him a traitor before World War II. Remember, Devoto never left the soil of the United States. He never visited Europe or even Canada, and yet he was not an isolationist. He was an internationalist.
A choice and an intellectual perspective, right? So where you're from, and this goes back to your question about the role of geography, your role of connection to terrain. Right? Where you're from shapes a lot of you, but it doesn't mark you forever. In a sense, you can choose to be different.
Devoto had fundamental ideas that grew out of what he experienced on the ground. There was nothing abstract about his reasoning.
Well, related to this, the traveling and the being there, right? You've traveled a lot of places, and you've written lots of books about your travels. How is it different when you're traveling in your own country? And do you find yourself applying the same or trying to look at, say, Nebraska the same way that you looked at the Gobi Desert?
It's more challenging, and here's why it's more challenging: because when you're in the Gobi Desert or someplace, you pick a place, you know that only a very small number of people have seen what you've seen. Therefore, even if the writing is mediocre, it's going to seem fresh because nobody else has seen it.
Mount Rushmore is a different problem.
And the few people who have seen it tend to be very scrupulous area experts who will find out any mistake you made, but there are very few of them. So you can slip into cliche and not be caught for it all the time. When you're looking at your own country, you know every reader, everybody, large numbers of people have seen what you've seen. Therefore, the only way you can make it into a reasonable piece of writing is to have a perception, an idea, an insight that others don't have generally. So it makes, you have to operate on a higher level in a sense. Right. You're not traveling through a place in West Africa or a place in northern Japan or someplace. You're describing Nebraska or the New Jersey Turnpike. You better have something original to say, or else it's a failure.
What about the experience of interviewing and listening to people when you travel? Because this is related to the idea. these are your fellow Americans, but they are people that perhaps before you went to Nebraska, you didn't know anybody from Nebraska or anybody from West Africa.
In 1998, I published a fairly long book, An Empire Wilderness, which was I crossed the country back and forth several times, and I was a reporter, and I interviewed people. I did profiles of people. I went out of my way to meet people, to listen to them, to quote them, to check back, did I hear them right, and all this. And I didn't want to do the same book again. I wanted to do something different. So I decided what I wanted to do in this book was to be an analyst, not a reporter. And what an analyst does is an analyst looks for what people say, not what people say, but what they omit, but which is true nevertheless. An analyst works inside the silences, inside the things that are not said or spoken. And an analyst doesn't interrogate people, which is what reporters do. And when you interrogate people, you'll catch them at their worst, maybe at their best. It won't come out of their mouths the way they really wanted to say it because they're a bit nervous or whatever. So I felt that something more honest and different from my previous America book was just to overhear and listen to people, and just to not talk to anyone for 6 weeks straight, and just keep a diary of what comes into my mind and what I overhear in conversations. So it's not a perfect way of doing things. It has flaws, but I didn't want to do the same book twice. I wanted to try something different.
Did you ever have a moment where you were unobtrusively or thought you were unobtrusively listening and overhearing where you noticed that people noticed you were listening and overhearing?
Well, only once, and I was in a restaurant in Wyoming, and I got a phone call from an editor, and we were talking back and forth. And somebody listened to me and came over and started talking to me.
Because they figured out who you were, or they figured out at least that you were somebody who was.
I was somebody not from there.
Yeah, right. Interesting. And did that change? Did the atmosphere around you change after
Not
that person?
that much.
So,
no.
Did you encounter? We talk about the difference between coastal elites and the people of the interior. Did you ever feel like once you opened your mouth, once people heard your accent, that were you ever made to feel a stranger? No, I didn't. I felt that this was a very cohesive country, but one where, and this is what I saw visually, but that the thing we love to refer to and talk about, the middle class, quote unquote, was disappearing before my eyes. What I saw was beyond the coasts, beyond the university towns, and beyond a dynamic city here and there, the middle class didn't exist anymore. What I saw was a larger, a substantial amount drifting upward into the global elite. And it wasn't by state, it was even in western Nebraska. There was one restaurant that served health foods where people were sipping Chardonnay and where they were on their smartphones sitting alone. But to that one restaurant, every other eating place within 20 or 30 miles was worse than fast food. It was something below fast food, because the majority that didn't slip upward into the global elite had slipped downward out of the middle class into a precarious working class existence where there were just maybe one or two misfortunes away from poverty. And so I think that though I traveled 9 months before the presidential campaign even began, I saw a country where the middle class was disappearing, and I think that explains a lot. Did you, since this is a good test case because it was before the campaign began, so people weren't talking specifically about politics. But what did you get from? Did you overhear political discussions?
No, that was the thing.
Yeah.
Nobody talked about politics. Not nobody, but almost never. For instance, I was traveling at a time when everyone was condemning Jeb Bush for having a bad answer to why his brother got involved in the Iraq War. And remember all those news stories. I traveled at a time when we initialed the Iran nuclear accord, zero. Nobody knew about it, cared about it. The feeling I got was from most of the country that don't give us more 9/11s and don't give us more Iraq wars. Anything between those extremes, you work out the details, you people in Washington. But you get near those extremes, suddenly there's a popular reaction.
Wherever that, and yet it's hard to know where that moment is.
And also, people react according to their own, what happens to them between when they get up in the morning and go to bed at night. So people cannot, nobody knows what TPP is, the Trans-Pacific Trading Pact is. They don't know what this, they're not following the debate. Right. But they do know that the middle class is disappearing, that there are much fewer manufacturing jobs than there should be in the interior reaches of the continent. And they see this, economic global power rising, China, and so their reactions to it are crude and ill-informed, but yet it's based on a truth. Mm-hmm. It's based on an experiential truth. What happened, how their own lives and communities have changed.
I wanted to broaden the frame just slightly here, right? Since you talk about geography, and you've obviously written a lot about geopolitics as a broad explanatory or analytical term. What does it mean to you when you talk about the geopolitics of the United States, or how do you use that term?
What it means to me is we're essentially the last resource-rich part of the temperate zone to be settled during and slightly after the European Enlightenment, where in the temperate zone, where to the north is essentially the Canadian Arctic, because Canada demographically is Chile laid on its side. All Canadians live within 100 miles of the U.S. border. So, and it's all middle class. So there's no threat there. It's,
Sure.
And the only geopolitical challenge, and I consider this a modest one that's been blown out of proportion, is the relatively poorer country to the south, and with a higher birth rate, younger population, not just of Mexico, but of Central America. Protected by two oceans, and this is one thing Wallace Stegner pointed out, is the river systems. Mm-hmm. I mean, Wallace Stegner was writing about the river systems in the 1940s and 1950s, how we have an arable cradle of rivers laid not over not laid over the demographically poor Great American Desert and Rocky Mountain, but over the fertile soil of the Middle West, so that even a city like Pittsburgh is connected to world trade because it's on the Ohio River, which flows into the Mississippi, which flows into the Caribbean, to the great sea lines of communication. And the river system is, there's more miles of navigable inland waterways than much of the rest of the world combined. Mm-hmm. And it's a river system that's diagonal, it's not perpendicular like in Russia. Which separates the country, so it unites the country. Stegner has this wonderful phrase, how all the rivers flow together. He wrote this about 70 years ago, basically. And so on the one hand, we're protected, or have been protected, from the convulsions of Afro-Eurasia. On the other hand, we're connected to the world due to our waterways and sea lines of communication. So we have the ability to lead while at the same instance being somewhat protected. 9/11 may have happened and all of that, but nevertheless, we're protected from Muslim migrations from the Middle East, unlike Europe. Europe is really the fight club. You know, it's going to get all the immigration from the Middle East for decades to come from Africa, and not because Africa is failing, but because it's in the early stages of starting a middle class, which leads to more demographic upheaval, not less, because many people now in Africa have the ability to leave and go to Europe, whereas before they didn't.
And the ambition to do more things.
So, you know, the idea that certain African countries are a success story because the economic growth rate is growing, is increasing, it's not even a one-dimensional way of looking at things. It's more superficial than that. It gets really complex. So we're both protected and involved. So as I said, we're fated to lead.
Right. Well, that's we get to that the question of fate. Right?
Yeah.
Whenever anybody talks about geography, you talk about geopolitics. You know, in the subtitle to The Revenge of Geography is "Coming Conflicts and the Battle Against Fate," which it's a great phrase. But what exactly is fate? Right? All geopolitical analysts have to wrestle with the charge that emphasizing geography leads to a kind of determinism, especially when it's combined with a retrospective bias that assumes everything that happened had to happen. So we constantly trip over the question of inevitability, which appears to defeat the very purpose of historical analysis. If it's inevitable, then there's nothing to debate. How do you respond to the problem of inevitability and
Well,
fate?
the Greeks invented the concept of fate,
Yes.
and it's in Aeschylus, it's in Sophocles, Euripides, it's in Shakespeare, basically. And to an extent, we're all semi-fatalists, because we all, you know, base whatever we do based on probabilities that stem from the past. If your child is accepted to Harvard and 4 other state universities, you may say he should go to Harvard because the chances are, according to fate, that he'll go further there. He'll meet people who will further him more. You know, it's why we try to send our children to good schools, to live in good neighborhoods. On a minute-by-minute basis, we're all semi-fatalists. So for someone to say, I don't believe in fate, you couldn't operate in your life or in the world. It's a balance. It really is a balance. Geography is fate in a way. I mean, Taiwan is 98 miles from China. Right. If it were 20 miles, the width of the English Channel, the Chinese would have conquered Taiwan in the late 40s or early 1950s. I mean, that's fate. That's fate. On the other hand, as I always say, if all you believe in is geography and geopolitics, you're missing 50% of reality and what's likely to happen. Because 50% of everything is Shakespeare. In other words, it's human passion. It's assessing personalities. You can't look at the last decade, not this decade, the decade previously, without George W. Bush having made the fatal decision to appoint Donald Rumsfeld as his Secretary of Defense rather than Dan Coates of Indiana. And he was this close to appointing Coates. Now, had he appointed Coates, Coates would have brought in Armitage as his Deputy Secretary, and the whole history of the decade would have been different. So, you know, that's Shakespeare.
Well, that's
that's the battle of personalities that nobody could predict in advance, that the president, George W. Bush, couldn't have predicted an hour before he made the decision.
Right. Well, and of course, then we even get into the idea of 539 votes in Florida would have made that situation very different as well, right? Well, I'm glad you brought in this question of individual choice and human choice and the role of leaders, because in your book you make reference to Walter Russell Mead's different American foreign policy traditions and emphasis on the Jacksonian tradition, which is this tradition, especially in the interior of the country, people who feel as though sort of interaction with the outside world is optional. You can stay away from it, you can ignore it, but then when struck, you strike back hard with violence. Right? In some ways, right, this is the most irresponsible of the traditions. But it is profoundly American.
And it's the most basic.
It's the most basic.
Because as is pointed out in the book, originally by Walter Russell Mead, the elites are Hamiltonians or they're Jeffersonians or they're Wilsonians. The average American has no idea of this, and even if it's explained to them, they don't follow it. But the Jacksonian tradition of we're not out to save the rest of the world, but if you cause us harm, we're going to hunt you down and kill you, is at the basis of the American soul.
Well, and what's the role of American leaders to, I guess, to encourage an awareness of the outside world enough so that the United States doesn't vacillate between extremes of disengagement and aggression?
Well, that's been our tragedy, especially in recent presidential cycles, is we tend to vacillate between extremes. We get a National Security Council under President Obama, which is one extreme. Now you get one under another extreme. And one of the themes of the book is that our geography, because it's ambiguous, because we're both connected to the outside world, but we're also protected from it, argues for what I call, a realistic, realist internationalism. And realist internationalism, who embodies that? James Baker, George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, Brent Scowcroft, you name it.
And I guess realism is it's a very comforting term, right? Because people suggest if only we could be more realistic, because we want to believe that reality is such that if people understood it, we could predict their behaviors. But the reality of the world today is, according to a brilliant author I've read before, is we have to deal with the coming anarchy. Right, reality is not all that good. Right, reality is actually kind of frightening, and so how can we be both realistic and calm? How can we be both realistic and internationalist? How do we not succumb to the temptation to want to shut it all out and hide behind the oceans?
We do it by assessing each crisis based on what are our security interests. And consistent with those interests, how can we improve the situation? We try to widen the scope of civil society worldwide, but not get too legalistic about it. In other words, don't lecture enlightened authoritarianisms like in Oman, Morocco, Jordan, places like that, or previously Singapore, and tell them they should, have full-bodied, cold turkey democracy. That wouldn't lead to more liberal systems. It would lead to chaos in those places. So don't be insisting on your historical experience everywhere. It's the knowledge that our particular historical experience is ours. It's not theirs.
And so that's an argument for encouraging education and area expertise, right?
I've always been a big believer in area expertise. The scholars I respect the most are area specialists. Because, look, here's an argument. If you want to say Egypt should be democratic, it should hold elections, because that's the moral thing to do, that argument works in a 30-second soundbite, because you don't need to know anything about Egypt. You never need to go there or anything. But if you say Egypt works better under an enlightened dictator who's much more moral and less bloodthirsty than the Assads or Saddam Hussein, but also runs a military dictatorship that's, working to improve the economy. Well, if you say that doesn't work as well in a soundbite, and you better know something about the country to back up your argument. So realism is not as attractive in a short soundbite, and requires knowledge of the places you're talking about. And area expertise is built on local knowledge and local histories and local culture and an awareness of it. So I find that area experts tend to be moderate in foreign policy, whereas people who've never traveled abroad except to go on Washington fact-finding trips where they meet with the embassy and meet with some high people for a week and fly home and say that they know all about the country. Those people tend to be extreme. Now, the foreign correspondents tend to be very moderate. For instance, people forget this debate, But in the 1990s, there were a whole group of people in Washington who were demanding that China be democratic. And all the China experts and the foreign correspondents who had actually lived in China and had knew the country said, that's a horrible idea. If you had that, you would have ethnic warfare between the Turkic Uyghur Muslims and the Han Chinese, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
I want to pick up on this, but also I know that we've got some questions coming from the audience. Is any questions? Oh, hands are going up. That's great. This young man right here in the front. The microphone's going to come to you.
Talking about the declining middle class at a time when most of us have always understood that it's the middle class that produces our strength. It sounds pretty depressing, and I just wonder how can you reconcile that with the article that was written by your colleague James Fallows in the Atlantic. He talked about crossing the country back and forth in a small plane and saw all this wonderful development in all these out-of-the-way small towns across the country. Is that consistent with what you're saying? Is that
America has always been a country of extraordinary individuals and individualism. So if you're looking for positive stories, you'll find it everywhere. I was not looking for positive or negative stories. I was just describing what I saw in front of me. I avoided inner cities. I dealt with inner cities in my previous book on the United States. So I was not looking for bad things, but what I found was very disturbing. As I said, to be an analyst is not to talk to people, but to listen to the silences, the things that people don't say and talk about. And often the people who talk to reporters are the most articulate people. They're very articulate. I was interested in the people who weren't articulate. People who were in the next booth in the restaurant with me, talking about their knee and back problems, about their belief in God, gossiping about their neighbors, which we all do, and about all their financial problems. And I heard this over and over and over and over again, yet there was no discussion of politics. Remember, this is the spring of 2015. And I think if you compare what I wrote at the time and what's happening now in the country, you see this is very consistent. Because what Donald Trump represents is a sort of anti-politics, a sort of a primal scream from people whose lives were just getting worse and worse, and they had no outlet. And they didn't know who to complain about or what to say. And then somebody comes along and they say, that's it. He's a wrecking ball? Fine, let's try a wrecking ball.
See, and of course that gets back to you're talking about area expertise and needing to understand the world, right? It is very tempting just to say, I don't need to understand the world. I'm just going to bring in the wrecking ball.
And that's a normal attitude if you're like most people who doesn't follow the op-ed page of the New York Times or all the other things that we all read, doesn't really read world affairs. All they know is that their lives have gotten worse.
Right here.
I would like to ask you to comment on the relationship, on the one hand, between geography and whatever it means in terms of fate and technology. And especially in the two areas that you were talking about, we're protected on one hand, and we are connected and can be leaders on the other. So in Manifest Destiny, we're protected and we can fill out the continent. Perhaps Theodore Roosevelt sends the ships around the world and we're now moving out. Yeah. And as things speed up, where do you see both the protective nature of our geographical situation and our ability to reach out and lead in terms of the electronic and travel?
Geography, technology rather, has not defeated geography, but it has shrunk geography. It's made it smaller. We're living in a more crowded, congested, interactive Earth where every crisis interacts with every other. The Baltic Sea, the Black Sea, the South China Sea, each ricochets off the other in a way that it never did before. Attrition of the same adds up to big change. And so while we've always had this interconnectivity, it's much more extreme now than it's ever been. And the fact that America is less protected from global cataclysms because of technology, financial markets, terrorism, etc., means that the only way we've found to deal with it is to try to export democracy abroad. If we're not as protected as we were before, we'll make the world exactly the way we are. This was Wilsonianism, and what it was deep down another form of isolationism, because it failed to take into account the different historical experiences of others. And I don't want to be critical of Wilson, because his actual views became more and more subjective and nuanced as he had failures as he saw failures in Haiti, the Philippines, Mexico, other places. By the time he left the White House, he was a very cautious thinker. But people have taken his name in vain to make very extreme arguments about what's possible in the world. And so think of it as this way: technology brings the world closer, and our response has been, we'll make all the world democratic. So they're like us.
I would say this is one of the challenges with traveling, right? Is that people travel, and often the first thing they'll say is they want to believe that everybody, every place they go, is just like them. When in a way, the idea of going to different places is to meet people who are not just like you.
Right, and one of the mistakes that's made is people go abroad, academics, others, and they meet with people just like themselves in the capital city, who are other members of the global elite. It could be in a poor country, but it has members of the global elite who they meet with, who explain things to them, and they say, oh, this person is so cautious and moderate and brilliant. Of course this country has a bright future, because he's running a movement and we're going to support the movement, and yet they have no idea what's going on at the border posts, at the edges of the country. So just traveling alone doesn't necessarily make you open-minded.
Mm-hmm. Good. Question right here.
I want to ask a question on microgeographics. The South China Sea, I don't know what China's goals are. Obviously, they'd like to dominate the region, intimidate the countries. The president's cancellation of the trade pact is just as apt to drive some of that trade over to China rather than to us. But with the size of container ships now carrying 18,000 containers, do sea lanes restricted very much? It doesn't make much of a difference. You can ship tremendous loads over great distances at low cost with the container ships, and if you have to go further, it's not a big deal.
So that's a technical but an interesting question.
Yeah,
Right? You still have to,
let me answer it through geography.
Sure.
A lot has changed in the world in the last millennium, but the Strait of Malacca is still of just a few miles wide. Mm-hmm. And because it's only a few miles wide and only half of that mileage is navigable, China has known for a long time it's getting too much of its oil and natural gas through a very vulnerable waterway, and has therefore needed to diversify. So China has been building roads and railways and pipelines into hydrocarbon-rich Central Asia. It's been building ports across the Indian Ocean and even a military facility in Djibouti on the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb. And it's been doing this all to get oil, natural gas, into China from Central Asia or to the Indian Ocean, then up by pipeline through the Burmese jungles into China, all because the Strait of Malacca is only a few miles wide. And yes, there are other straits, the Sunda-Lombok Straits in the Indonesian archipelago, but nevertheless, geographical features still matter. And yes, shipping rates may go down, but it's still better to be in the shortest place between two distances.
Because when you look at a globe, there looks like there's a lot of ways to get from one place to another, but there are better and worse ways.
Right.
Yeah. Right here, please.
The declining middle class that you were seeing, or the disappearance of the middle class you were seeing, is that geographical? Or in other words, is it just in the middle parts of the country that that's occurring, or is that happening everywhere?
It's partly geographical, partly. As I said, you can find very globally connected, well-off people in unsuspecting places, in the most rural parts of Wyoming, western Nebraska. But generally speaking, I'll give you an example. I drove for days along the Ohio River Valley, Wheeling, West Virginia, Portsmouth, Ohio, one town after another of 20, 30,000 where the downtown was totally deserted, shelled out, disasters. But then you come to a college town, Marietta, Ohio, which is just beautiful because it has a lovely, wonderful, hard to get into small liberal arts college, which goes back to the late 19th century. And then you travel for more days, nothing but shelled out towns. Then you get to Bloomington, Indiana, home of Indiana University, and you might as well be in Singapore. You're back with the global elite. So outside of what I call the coasts, the college towns, and successful cities, in the inner rural reaches of the country, the middle class is, disappearing or has substantially disappeared. Look at the vote in Missouri. We all hear, oh, Missouri went to Trump. Well, no, it didn't exactly. Kansas City and St. Louis voted for Hillary, but the whole rest of the state voted strongly for Trump. Because once you get out of the pulsing, relatively well-off parts of Kansas City with sophisticated upper middle class people, you're suddenly in places that have been badly hit.
Right. Question here, and then to the back.
Following up on the prior question, as you went through different parts of the United States having different greater affluence, as you've indicated, and lesser deteriorated affluence, as you've indicated, what are the commonalities that you've seen among different sectors of the United States that had similar circumstances? The depressed areas of upstate New York versus the depressed areas of the remote Midwest, the more dynamic cities of the Midwest, the Rocky Mountain states versus the East and stuff like that. What'd you take away about the similarities?
The commonalities that I saw coast to coast were deep reverence for the military. Wherever you go, roads, parts of highways are named after the military. There are historical markers about the cavalry settling the West. I've never seen a country with such reverence for the military as the United States. We're a settler frontier society still. And being in the military raises you in social prestige rather than lowers you. In Europe, what I found as a foreign correspondent there is the military is seen as civil servants in funny uniforms. You're not raised in social prestige by being in the military in Germany or France. It's a little different, and that's because they have a still existing imperial tradition. So it's a bit different there on the continent. But reverence for the military, reverence for local history. In other words, in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, James Buchanan may have been the worst president in American history.
So far.
Right, but, his home, Wheatland, is in excellent repair with a little museum, visitor center. all financed by the local wealthy people of the community because they're proud of it, because it's their history. And it happened there, and they will subsidize it and hope people learn from it. And wherever I went, there was this reverence for local history, reverence for the military. And to me, that says that still at bedrock, we're a country still.
Interesting. Back. In the back.
Yes, the area that you described as the hollowed middle class, I'm imagining are the red states. Is there an answer that is geographical for that, or is there an answer that is political for that?
It's actually a bit split, because the red states have big blue parts. Like Missouri, as I said a few minutes ago, is a red state, but St. Louis and Kansas City are big blue parts. Look at Pennsylvania. You have Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, and then you have Lower Alabama in the middle, which is the way that political consultants look at the state of Pennsylvania, actually. So states themselves are split, except in a few categories. Even Alabama itself is like that. You know, it's split up. So most states have split personalities. Most do. And because one side tends to show up more to vote than the other, you know, this was a very close election in places like Michigan, Wisconsin. What became technically red states were determined by tens of thousands of votes, not millions of votes.
It's interesting that we could have a whole discussion about the way that the electoral map of the Electoral College, how it shapes our sense of red and blue when actually it's much more nuanced.
Well,
and
the
complicated.
Electoral College is crude in the sense that, except in a few instances, you win one state, even by 2 votes, you get all the states' numbers.
We have time for, I think, one more question from the audience in the back.
Thank you very much. You mentioned in your presentation, right here.
Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned in your presentation the importance of the geography, and in particular the effect of the difference between the Formosan Straits and the Channel, the English Channel. You indicated that should the divide between mainland China and Formosa have been as large as the English Channel, the fate of Formosa might have been different. Yet, the Germans never invaded Britain during the Second World War, although they were separated only by the Channel. Do you care to elaborate on that concept and on that analogies?
Well, Germany sure came close. And if it wasn't for the Royal Air Force, it might have conquered Britain. And the very fact that it was close meant Germany was obliged to try. China never tried a sea-land invasion of Formosa, of Taiwan. And if it had only been 20 miles wide, they very well may have tried, like the Germans did against the British in 1940.
Right. To wrap all this up, it might not be fair to talk about a book other than the one that you just wrote, but in your epilogue to the paperback edition of The Revenge of Geography, you have this line: the smaller the world becomes because of technology, the more that every place in it becomes important. Technology is double-edged, right? It provides us the apparent comfort of niches and echo chambers, but it also deepens our connection. So how should we, both as individuals and as responsible citizens, how should we separate our individual experience of technology as isolating, or go beyond that to also emphasize the reality of connection to the broader world?
All right, first of all, as I said, technology has made geography more claustrophobic. It's made geopolitics more interactive and claustrophobic. There are no places in the world, or very few, that don't matter anymore, because you could have a crisis anywhere that could start a crisis in other places. I think the only way to bring your personal experience to that in the world is counterintuitive. It's getting away from technology. I don't tweet, I'm not on Facebook, I don't blog, and that gives me more time to read, you know?
Oh, I think we have to quit on that one. Thank you very much, Robert Kaplan, for this discussion.
Thank you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for being part of this discussion tonight. Of course, this discussion has to end, but the conversation continues on Geopolitics with Granary monthly. We are experimenting with this new format, and we'll be here again next month. We're also going to be developing new online audio offerings for conversations about international affairs. Please note that copies of Earning the Rockies are available for purchase, but you can't have mine. If you liked what you heard today and you liked what you saw, please tell a friend. Please bring a friend next time. We would like very much to thank the National Liberty Museum, BNY Mellon Wealth Management, and the Bradley Foundation for their generous support for this program. And to keep up with future episodes of Geopolitics with Granary, I will say this to you, but I can't say it to Bob Kaplan because he doesn't tweet and isn't on Facebook. But please friend us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, visit our website at fpri.org, and you can follow the host of this program as well. I'm on Twitter at Ronald Granary. But until next time, for all of us at FPRI, especially my colleagues in producing this broadcast, Eli Gilman, Peyton Wendell, and Rachel Hemler, I'm Ron Granary. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.